My name is Ann Albert, and I am the Klatt Family Director for Public Programs here at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, as many of you already know. We are here today, and I'm very pleased to welcome you for our final talk in our series called Canon in Context, in which scholars are leading us to think historically about major works of Jewish law. This series has been running all year long since September in connection with the topic of the Katz Center's academic fellowship program this year, which deals with Jews and pre-modern law in general. Researchers from across the field of Jewish studies are here looking at various contexts and manners in which Jewish law developed and operated from antiquity through the 18th century. As you know, for this public series, we've organized a set of talks about pre-modern, so again, up through the 18th century, efforts to compile or codify or organize the highly multivocal and decentralized Jewish legal tradition. We began with the Mishnah and the Talmud. We continued in January with Maimonides and the Shulchan Aruch. And last week, we picked up again with the first printing of the Talmud and the iconic format of its page. In each case, we've looked at how the authors or compilers thought about their work and understood its purpose and its relationship to their particular era. In case you missed those talks, as always, I direct you to the Katz Center's YouTube channel where recordings of them live for you to access freely. So this is the last talk in the Canon in Context series. We do have one more special lecture coming up later this month, featuring the Chancellor of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Menachem ben Sasson, speaking about the Israeli Declaration of Independence, its meaning in context, and its authority and impact moving forward. Meanwhile, we are also hard at work preparing our series for next year already, if you can believe it, and I hope you'll continue to follow us for information as that takes shape. Before we proceed, I have all the usual thank yous. The Katz Center's programs are, of course, only possible because of the efforts of my amazing colleagues, Becky Friedman, Diana Dennis-Walters, and Brian Lipscomb, and also all the rest of the staff of the Katz Center. Our financial sponsors also deserve special mention. These include the Klatt family, the Harry Stern Family Foundation, the Katz family, and other dedicated members of the Center's Board of Advisors. And finally, also the members of the Friends of the Katz Center, which is a circle of donors with particular interest in public programs like this one. So if you're interested in joining that group, you'll find a link in the chat. We are really grateful for everyone's commitment to supporting scholarship and expanding its reach in this way, and it's a real pleasure to be able to do it with you. All right, so finally, just a little reminder about how we proceed. In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker and turn things over to him. Once his presentation is finished, I'll come back and join him to moderate the Q&A. I do encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window at any time during the course of the presentation. I will get to as many of the questions as I possibly can. Now, to our speaker. I am very pleased to be able to introduce Joshua Teplitsky. He is Associate Professor of History at Stony Brook University. His work in general focuses on Jewish life in German-speaking lands of the early modern period, so the 16th to 18th centuries, with an emphasis on the city of Prague, and he has a current project on plague in the city of Prague. In general, he's interested in the interconnections between Jews of disparate locations, as well as the social, cultural, and intellectual exchanges between Jews and Christians. He is the author of an award-winning book, Prince of the Press, How One Collector Built History's Most Enduring and Remarkable Jewish Library. That was the winner of the Baron Prize for Best First Book in Jewish Studies in 2019. Congratulations, Josh. And that book explores the movement of Jewish books as commodities and how that movement operated in shaping the political culture of Jewish life in early modern Central Europe. And I think you'll see right off the bat the relationship between that topic and what we're having Josh speak to us about today. He's also the eminent co-leader of a digital humanities project called Footprints, Jewish Books Through Time and Place, which is a very cool way of tracking not only when books were published, but who owned them and where they ended up, how they moved through time. So we will now invite Josh to share with us some insights about how this movement of books and the sort of behind the scenes production of books connected to shaping what we understand to be the classic works of Jewish law. Welcome.
Thanks, Anne, for that very warm invitation, or rather introduction. I'm just going to take a moment to set up some images so that we can look at some items together, and then we'll get started. Great. And can I just ask you for a verbal confirmation that this is visible?
You are looking good.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you. Well, then, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by offering my thanks to Anne for the opportunity to come and share some of my thoughts, preliminary as some of them may be, with you here and thinking about canon and how they come together. My thanks to Diana and Brian for taking care of so many of the technical matters and making sure that everything here runs smoothly. And of course, my thanks to the Katz Center, a place that I've had the good fortune to be a fellow of more than once. And so it really feels like a sort of homecoming to be able to share my thoughts with you in this venue. Of course, my only regret is that we don't get to interact person to person, but it's lovely to have such a wonderfully robust audience of attendees here. And I hope that we'll be able to explore together some of the questions that come into the making of canon. The title of my talk today is Copyists, Collectors, and Curators Stalking the Rabbinic Bookshelf. And we're going to pivot somewhat from some of the directions that the other talks in this series have taken, but I hope in a complementary fashion. We're going to begin, perhaps paradoxically, not with a printed book, but rather with the title page of a manuscript that was copied in the year 1712. This item that is currently held in the Bodleian Library at the University of Oxford describes itself as follows. Book of the Tashbetz, a book of the laws of mourning by Maharam, and this book is cited by the Rosh and Mordechai and is still not found in print. Its inscription on this title page affixed to the copy of this manuscript elaborates or tells us precisely what this item is. It is a text that was written for mourning practices by the Maharam of Rothenburg, a medieval commentator. And the inscription elaborates and tells us that the text has been historically cited by prominent medieval Jewish authorities. The Rosh, or Asher ben Yechiel, who lived from 1250 to 1327, and the Mordechai ben Hillel HaKohen, who lived from 1250 to 1298. This is a book that found purchase in the Middle Ages and thereafter, attaining a kind of semi-canonical status in the making of rabbinic law, and yet, as this title page proclaims, is still not found in print. These words, still not found in print, 4 words in Hebrew, remind the reader not only of the present state of affairs, but also imply an ideal that has yet to be met, that this book ought to, and perhaps someday will, be committed to printing and will be more widely diffused. In today's discussion, I'd like to explore the interactions between the printing of books and their canonicity, and the collecting of manuscripts and their facilitation in becoming printed books. For the printing of books is a necessary, perhaps even essential ingredient in texts becoming canonical. For how does a text become part of a common, shared, authoritative body of information if it is shrouded in obscurity or is inaccessible? In today's discussion, we're going to follow the activities of early modern figures who enabled the accessibility of texts, whether in print or in manuscript, and thereby facilitated their entry into a canon of works that informed medieval, early modern, and even modern rabbinic legal thinking. Although I'll resist fully defining canon and leave that to you, our participants, our attendees today, to decide precisely what that means, And if you're persuaded by my words, I do hope that this will be a contribution of sorts to considerations of canon from the vantage point of collections. My contention today is that canonical books that reach a reading public, however limited or expansive, often go through twists and turns, and that works from the Middle Ages that readers perhaps of the modern era may take for granted as essential and near timeless classics are often the product of historical swerves and contingent decisions by a host of different actors. First and foremost among them are printers, but even decisions by printers depend on questions of accessibility. And so today's story is about resources and reservoirs, about access to books and activities that make such accessibility possible. In the limited time that we have, we'll follow two examples of the path of texts from the Middle Ages to the print shops of the 18th centuries, which in turn shaped the curricula and canon of Jewish rabbinic learning for centuries to follow. Our first of the two examples will follow the path to print of a medieval commentary that to this day accompanies traditional publications of the Bible, but that only first appeared in print centuries after it was authored. Our second example will move from the Bible to the Talmud, once again exploring the work of commentaries and commentators long thought lost, but on account of the power of print and the labor of collectors, came to be a canonical component of the curriculum of Talmud study in the modern era. It's my intention along the way to broaden somewhat our definition of the labor of making a canon away from simply authoritative figures or the work of printers into a wider world of the movers of books and manuscripts to hopefully still further complicate our image of how canons come to be. For pre-modern, responsibility for making books was a messy business. All of the participants in a book's publication, authors were not always the most important. An author, as an autonomous creative individual who produced a work based on singular genius, that is therefore his or her own intellectual property, is very much an invention of the modern age. In fact, it was only in protracted legal battles in Western Europe over the course of the 18th century that debates over the rights of intellectual property contributed to the notion of an autonomous creative author who was uniquely and fundamentally responsible for the genesis of a work of intellect. In the pre-modern period, the makers of books included so many more of the workers in the process. Not only the author, but also printers, publishers, and importantly, economic sponsors. This principle held especially when the author in question was long deceased, as was the case with medieval manuscripts that, like the one in front of you, had still not been printed. The ambiguous intermediate role of a publisher might then have been combined with that of a printer and bookseller, and the title pages of printed books acknowledge them as integral partners in a book's production. The front matter of Hebrew printed books often included a preface by the publisher who told the story of his labor to bring a book to the press. And in fact, it is that very front matter, the paratextual material, the introductions, not by the authors themselves, but rather by publishers who facilitated the printing of books, serve as my primary sources in our discussion today. By reading and working through various introductions to books, I aim to reconstruct and tell a story of how manuscripts thought lost came to be printed. This intermediary role of somebody who identified an ancient manuscript and brought it to an early modern or modern press was labeled as the Mevi le Diffus, literally the one who brings the item to the print, which captures this distinction of sorts between technical printer, original author, and that more expansive intermediary role of publisher. This sort of publisher was a more amorphous role, which could encompass financiers, agents, children of deceased writers, and a whole host of other people who had invested energy in facilitating the printing of works by authors long gone by bringing those works to the printing press. Our story today will explore one of the ways that printers and publishers acquired items to be brought to print by looking at an often unsung heroic role in the process, that of collector, curator, and preserver. Our discussion will revolve around the remarkable activities of a 17th and 18th century figure by the name of David Oppenheim. Born in Central Europe and serving as chief rabbi in Prague for the first third of the 18th century, Oppenheim's life spanned the last part of the 17th century and first part of the 18th, and in the course of his lifetime, he collected some 4,500 printed books and 1,000 manuscripts, all relating to Jewish life and literature. Oppenheim was a renowned rabbinic figure who was a sought-out decisor by Jews, rabbinic colleagues, supplicants across Europe and beyond. He was a familiar of kings and princes. His home and library collection was visited by Christian scholars, not only by Jews, sometimes by missionaries, Christian Hebraists, and a whole world of intellect and learning that transcended the Jewish-Christian divide. His library was a resource for students and scholars and for the daily operations of Jewish communities, ranging from matters of kashrut, marriage and divorce, or the constitution of Jewish political self-government in their various locales across the diaspora. It was also an essential reservoir for crafting aspects of an evolving rabbinic canon in the 18th century, with consequences for years to come. Oppenheim's contribution to the making of and reshaping of a canon was derived particularly from the wide network of contacts he maintained in his endless pursuit of books. Those collecting efforts often began at home, and his local commitments left an imprint on the collection as a whole. Let's give a bit of biography for this man, for it's my contention here that biography and geography certainly matter as part of these swerves of history. David Oppenheim was born in Worms in southwestern Germany in the year 1664. It's hard to say that the preceding decades had been kind ones to the German lands more generally. From 1618 until 1648, the center of the European continent had been ravaged by years of fighting, a series of interlocking conflicts that came to be known as the 30 Years' War. That war brought untold horrors to the inhabitants of the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. But when the fighting subsided, the peace that ensued created new opportunities for economic and political rebuilding. Many of the princes and rulers of these territories sought financiers and administrators for this rebuilding. Construction projects, military projects, even luxury projects, all aimed to reconstruct what had been after the war. And they most often employed the services of a wealthy class of Jews, who came to be known as court Jews. They settled upon Jews not because all Jews were wealthy, but rather because they could identify a tiny upper stratum of wealthy Jews who were prepared to take risks. As outsiders to the political elite, people who could not hold titles of nobility and who could therefore not challenge the established orders of succession and rank, this small stratum of Jews with a position of relative weakness, who were at the mercy of the royal patrons, were an important group that could offer services with little threat. As a result, they accumulated significant influence in their own communities, even if they were not necessarily the most influential in the wider courts in which they operated. They were able to exert an influence on the direction of policy towards less fortunate Jews, resulting in favorable conditions for their settlement in new places, and they also exerted an influence over Jewish local communities, donating portions of their wealth towards the upkeep of Jewish communal buildings and services, and, as we shall touch upon later, funding and subventing the production of print. David Oppenheim was born into the most prestigious of these families. His uncle, Samuel Oppenheimer, was the court Jew to the emperor in Vienna. Oppenheim's wider family network occupied positions of lower rank but still great significance to commercial life in German towns and cities like Heidelberg, which was the capital of the Rhineland-Palatinate, and Frankfurt am Main, a major center of Jewish life in the early modern period. Oppenheim's decision to assemble a library and establish his identity as a preeminent collector began in earnest in his late teen years and was informed deeply by local contexts, by the city of Worms in which he was born and raised. We don't know precisely when he began collecting his magnificent library. It likely started when he was a student with handwritten notes into notebooks in his lessons under master educators and teachers, stars and luminaries of the rabbinic constellation of his age. We do know, however, that the growth of this fledgling collection accelerated in the year 1682, at the time of his marriage at the age of 17, to the daughter of the court Jew of Hanover, whose name was Lechman Behrens. The daughter, soon to be wife of David Oppenheim, was named Genendel, and the event of their wedding occasioned the receipt of a trickle, stream, and then river of books into the collection as gifts. To impose order upon the books that he already owned and this cascade of new acquisitions, Oppenheim took one of the notebooks in his collection that he had used as a student and converted it into a personal inventory. This once blank notebook had been gifted to him in the year 1675. He had copied it into a text or made it into a textbook for calendrical calculation, but as he accumulated still more and more books, the notebook of a student became the logbook of a collector. And on the 63rd page of this blank paper volume, Oppenheim began to catalog his growing library. He produced thus an inventory of his possessions, but was sensitive doubly to the world of books. On the one hand, to the contents of the library, on the other hand, to the ways in which he acquired those objects. His catalog twice listed the books, first organizing all of the titles in alphabetical order, designating a blank page for each letter, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, adding items to each page over time as he accrued and accumulated still more. But he then created a second list to record the provenance, the source of the books, paying attention to the people from whom he acquired them, the places in which he acquired them, and the price that he paid for each. The catalog thus represents the accumulation of books over time, reveals a collection that, at its last editing, numbered somewhere between 460 and 490 items, an impressive number, as at this time, the Judaica library, the Jewish bookshelf, was relatively small. To give an example, only about 2,000 items existed in print. The pages of this catalog reveal the contacts with book agents in the city and the circumstances by which books flowed into this collection in his hometown of Worms. The first entries in his ledger record gifts, but very quickly on the purchases reflect the local availability of books in Worms and perhaps his deep cultural identification with his hometown. For example, in 1686, he spent 2.2 Reichstaler on a purchase of 10 volumes from a vendor in the city, which included items that had been produced both there but also from further flung points, Riva di Trento, Mantua, Venice, and Prague. 2 years before Rosh Hashanah, in the autumn of 1686, he purchased almost 100 items from Zanvil of Mannheim, a scribe in the city who doubled both as a copyist of books and as a seller of items that had come from far away. This is because in the absence of bookstores, individual authors, scribes, and secondhand dealers would double as vendors of literary products, taking to the roads to peddle books that they had written, published, or bought from others. Indeed, the entire secondhand book and manuscript trade was deeply important. And just as a reminder, the reason that I'm sharing this with you is so that we think about all of this often unrecorded labor that comes into the world of making books and producing canons. Ad hoc sales by the poor to the wealthy were, for example, an important way in which collections could grow. And they help us to even permit a reconstruction of different sorts of class relations as they're reflected by books as commodities. Oppenheim had near unlimited resources, born as he was into a family of supreme wealth. But the financial needs of others often significantly drove this collection forward as well. He would buy portions of libraries or even libraries in their entirety from the estates of former users. In particular, quite often from widows, from women who had survived their, their original owners whose husbands had passed away, and yet who had greater need of liquid cash than the books as objects or as facilitators of scholarly participation, as they were formally excluded from a world of rabbinic scholarship. Thus, for example, on the 6th of April, 1688, Oppenheim recorded the purchase of 37 volumes for his collection by purchasing them from the widow of one Joseph Halevi. In September of 1691, 3 years later, he procured some 19 books from the widow of Avram or Abraham Stern of Worms for a sum of 20 Reichstaler and 12.5 batzen. These small-scale book collectors tend to be far more modest in their holdings. Many of them were printed in the early modern period rather than the Middle Ages, but they help us to get a sense of the full field of the movement and exchange of books and manuscripts as objects that were put into motion by different forms of supply and demand, of need and fulfillment, and of different cultural and communal contexts. It was in Worms that Oppenheim collected a whole series of different sorts of books and manuscripts that related to the history of Jewish life in the city. His manuscript collection included items by the Rhineland Pietists, especially Elazar of Worms, as well as more recent books by Kabbalists of the 16th and 17th centuries. His collection captured the history of German Jewry in the chronicles of the great Yossel of Rosheim, the autobiography of Yom Tov Lippmann Heller, martyrologies and crusade chronicles, the religious life of Worms Jews' prayers, customs, and even lists of the names of residents of the city, all of which became part of the collection as well. For our purposes, the most striking instance of Oppenheim's participation in preserving and restoring an aspect of a lost history and in creating a canon is the role he played in discovering and publishing the Torah commentary of Rashbam, the 12th century rabbi Samuel ben Meir of Troyes, who lived from 1085 to 1158. Rashbam was a grandson of the great Rashi, an luminary of the medieval Rhineland, and the story of the publication of his commentary to the Torah is one of accidents, false starts, doubts, and necessarily of collectors' decisions. While Oppenheim was still just a young man, hoping to build a great collection, but far from realizing that end, his relationship with a bookseller, perhaps one of those that we mentioned above, he doesn't give the name, led him to a trove of documents in a synagogue attic, a geniza of sorts, a depot of discarded Jewish texts. According to Oppenheim's tale, the seller told him that the discarded materials that were languishing in this attic included thousands of manuscripts that had been abandoned over centuries. They were, in Oppenheim's telling, fetid, dusty, moldy, infested with vermin, rotting from exposure to rain, and nibbled upon by mice and rats. Oppenheim described, though, his process of climbing to the synagogue attic and fumbling through the discarded pages, convinced that, quote, "The Lord brought this book into my hands, a writing of truth, of ink on parchment," especially as in that attic he fortuitously discovered two remarkable works for the heritage of Worms Jewry. One, the Rashbam's biblical commentary from the 12th century, and second, a copy of the Mahzor Vitri, the first complete prayer book of medieval Ashkenaz. It's unlikely that either of these items were written, or rather, it's unlikely that either of these literal objects were produced in the 12th century. Rather, they were likely to be copies of copies produced over time by different teachers and students. But the Rashbam had never been committed to print. Oppenheim did not race to publish this manuscript. In fact, a period of some 20 years elapsed between his discovery and its appearance on the printing press. Rashbam's commentary is distinct from many other medieval readings of the Bible, particularly in its fidelity to the plain and literal interpretation of Scripture's words. It is perhaps even more noteworthy because all of the commentaries that attended the printed page since the earliest publications of the Rabbinic Bible, none other than Rashi had an Ashkenazic provenance. Yet Oppenheim hesitated. His doubt of the author's desire to circulate the text led him to resist publication for a near 2 decades after the initial discovery. With the passage of time, Oppenheim showed this treasure of the manuscript to colleagues, friends, and even students, but rebuffed their suggestions to publish the work, reticent to print a manuscript that may never have been intended for the public eye, and that may have altered the way that others read the text of the Torah. Yet after 20 years of resisting the book's publication, in 1705, circumstances were propitious for a change. Oppenheim was approached by an intermediary who had some influence over him. He was approached by a man by the name of Joseph ben Moses of Przemysl, or Yosef Darshan, the preacher. It was this Joseph who had been living in Berlin who had arranged the circumstances for this manuscript's ultimate printing. Berlin at the time housed a press that was willing to invest in endeavors of this sort. In the year 1705, a new academy was founded, the Berlin Academy of Science, which had a mandate of research rather than what its founder saw as an earlier and outmoded model of curiosity. Berlin did not have a Jewish-owned printing house, but was home to an enthusiastic Christian scholar of Hebraica, the professor and court preacher Daniel Ernest Jablonski, who was one of the co-founders of the Berlin Academy, in fact with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a famous member of the early Enlightenment. Jablonski opened the first Hebrew printing house in the city, thus a house that was involved between Christian and Jewish interests, sometimes at odds with each other, and employed Jewish workers there. And Joseph, this intermediary, was one of the figures who worked in the printing house and kept his eyes open for the publication of presses of this nature. It thus happened that in the year 1705, for the first time ever, Oppenheim released his manuscript and allowed it to be taken to the city of Berlin, where it was edited, typeset, and ultimately printed in that year. We know more about the details of this discovery because when the text was published, it featured an 8-page preface by David Oppenheim, one of the longest published pieces of his writing during his entire lifetime. The preface began with a declaration of a sort of ban of copyright, which would last 15 years from the completion of the publication, but was far more than a mere assertion of intellectual property. It was in this text that Oppenheim took the opportunity to introduce readers to Rashbam and his work, a necessity given the fact that it was a text that had been not studied and not available, or rather only available in a very limited fashion, for centuries prior. Weaving citations of verses together in a style quite characteristic of his particular authorial voice, Oppenheim linked great biblical ancients with moderns and cloaked more recent authority in ever greater symbolism of Israel's influential prophets and leaders. In the course of his introduction, he explained to his readers how he had identified this text as authentically authored by Rashbam, adamant in the face of potential doubters that he had done due diligence in matching the manuscript against references to statements by Rashbam cited in other texts, writing as follows, quote, "Everything which I have seen in printed books in the name of Rashbam can be found in this composition," demonstrating that this scholar and writer's texts had left an impact in the work of those who had succeeded him, even as the text had not been fully accessible and available, and thus as impactful as it could fully be. Oppenheim's entire narrative carried a providential tone to it, a discovery akin to a Sinaitic epiphany, a pressure to print as a fulfillment of a divine mission. The book appeared with not one but 2 title pages. In addition to its first page that you can see on the screen here telling about the publication of the 5 books of Moses or Torah in the year 1705, a second title page was affixed to the volume that highlighted the unique new novel publication of the Book of Rashbam. And the text in front of you reads, "This is the Book of Rashbam," even though it is so much more than that. The small print continues as follows, quote, "It has been discovered in the trove of holy books of our master, our teacher, our rabbi of all of the diaspora, David Oppenheim. May his creator protect him. He is chief rabbi and Rosh Yeshiva of the holy community of Nikolsburg. The flag of his love is spread over all the provinces of Moravia, and he has given permission to print it with the aid of the one who dwells on high." As you can see, a banner of text frames the page and offers all kinds of verses of tribute to Oppenheim's biblical namesake, King David. It's adorned with verses about King David there, all in order to highlight the prestige and power of the person who held the manuscript, allowed it to be printed, and in the process shaped and reshaped the canon of biblical reading. Oppenheim played an essential role not solely in providing the material for texts we now see as canonical, but also shaping the supply of books and stocking shelves in the process. The new edition of the Bible was received with great success. In fact, within months, Jablonski began work on the next volume. This alone was the book of Genesis or Breshit, and in the months to follow, Jablonski began to work on the second volume, this time contacting Oppenheim for support not for the intellectual material of texts, but rather for financial backing. On the 12th of October, 1705, Jablonski wrote to Oppenheim in a melange of German and Hebrew, asking the rabbi to use his influence and his familial connections to purchase 50 copies of a different recently printed book, the Arba Turim, the halachic work of the medieval scholar Jacob ben Asher. The revenue from these copies of the book would, in Jablonski's plan, go for the express purpose of funding the next volume of the Pentateuch with its accompanying commentaries. And so when Jablonski reached out to Oppenheim, he understood that this man was a figure who played a role both in providing material to printers, but also in facilitating the dissemination of works to be used and read by Jews, thereby to attain and enhance their canonical status. Books prior to this time, or rather rabbis made decisions prior to this time based on a relatively limited supply of canonical texts. But the printing press had effected a kind of watershed, a kind of shift in understandings that no longer should a tight and narrow canon influence the way that decisions were made, but rather an argument for an ever-expanding range of sources. The rabbinic decisor would thereafter, was already in the 17th and 18th centuries, responsible for basing decisions on bibliographic comprehensiveness, on breadth, and not only on depth alone. Oppenheim was a part of this process in his dissemination of texts, sometimes of rare texts, sometimes of texts that one would think would be readily available, but were quite difficult to attain. In fact, in the year 1704, Oppenheim received a letter from the scribe of Krakow's Jewish community, who wrote to thank Oppenheim for sending one book, but to remind him that he had made a commitment to send 2 copies of a recently printed edition of the Talmud. In requesting copies of that Talmud, the scribe of Krakow was not asking Oppenheim to send him an exotic work, but rather he and by extension the Krakow community were indicating often the dearth, the rare supply of even fundamental and essential books for the work of Jewish study and of Jewish law. In fact, the Talmud was a deeply important and significant or partly reshaped volume in the early years of the 18th century as well, thanks to the inclusion of new texts, or rather of old texts given new life. Oppenheim played an important role in this process as well, particularly as he had access to a place and space that bridged a divide between Jewish cultures, not by drawing on the local and familiar in the city of Worms, but rather by aiding movement into a canon through more circuitous paths in the borderlands between different Jewish cultures as they met in the land of Israel. Over the course of the final decade of the 17th century, Oppenheim had kept up a series of regular exchanges with book dealers in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was of particular interest to Oppenheim on account of its position as a hub in the transit of manuscripts, especially works that had come from medieval Iberia. When the waves of exiles from medieval Spain and Portugal crashed across the Mediterranean basis in Ottoman Empire, any number of them brought with them rabbinic manuscripts in tow. Their manuscripts were exciting for a bibliophile like Oppenheim, as the copying of manuscripts often followed sub-ethnic patterns of diffusion. Items of Iberian origin were somewhat rarer in Ashkenazic Central Europe than in the new lands settled by Sephardim. In fact, we can get a sense of the rareness of these texts by a traveler from Prague to the Holy Land in the year 1650, who wrote a travel guide back to others who might be interested in emigrating or traveling to the land of Israel, indicating that there are many books, but the harder books to find are those of Ashkenazic provenance. By extension, those of Sephardic provenance are much easier to find in the city. And indeed, Oppenheim had book agents, sellers, marketers who would send him all kinds of books written in a Sephardic hand. You can see those on the screen in front of us, two copies rather, of the same text, one written in a Sephardic hand, the other in an Ashkenazic hand, as they were transliterated for him, transcribed for him from one hand into another in order to become accessible. In fact, Oppenheim was so important to the Jews of Jerusalem that they sent him a letter in the year 1697, naming him as their Prince of Jerusalem, an important charity officer in the process. In order to sweeten the deal, they sent not only letters, but also rare manuscripts. On the screen in front of you, you can see a commentary by Nachmanides, and I'll give you a list of other precious items that flowed into his collection. Rabbinic writings on the Talmud, including those by Nissim ben Reuben of Gerona on tractate Bava Metzia, by Asher ben Yechiel the Rosh on tractates Zeraim and Taharot, or rather on the orders Zeraim and Taharot, by Nachmanides' commentary on Ketubot, and the commentary of the Meiri on tractate Shabbat, among others. Many of these Talmudic commentaries had long survived in manuscript and indeed had circulated in limited fashion in manuscript, but Oppenheim made their wider circulation possible, especially as in the last decades of the 17th century and the first decades of the 18th century, different enterprising printers aimed to produce new, attractive editions of the Talmud with texts and commentaries that had been thought lost. Perhaps most bold among these was a Rabbi Judah Aryeh Leib ben Shmuel of Frankfurt am Main, who collaborated and cooperated with other Jews and Christians, including a professor of theology at the University of Frankfurt, to produce a new edition of the Talmud. That edition appeared on the presses of Amsterdam between the years 1714 and 1717. And in Leib's introduction, he told a story that began in the age of manuscript, an era that, in his assessment, had produced an unwieldy diversity of versions, which then, coupled with the diffusion of the printed word, produced a disseminated, flawed text in the Talmud prior to his time. He credited rabbis who had preceded him, especially those of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, like rabbis Shlomo Luria, the Maharshal, and Shmuel Edas, the Maharsha, with returning the text to its more pristine edition. He cited new rabbinic ideas about curricular reform, but argued that it was time for a new edition of the Talmud that would move and return others to Talmudic study and away from compendia and codes. But Leib's edition had a further benefit. It incorporated what he saw as unique and previously inaccessible material, many of them derived from Oppenheim's shelves. Here is an excerpt from the introduction to this publication. He writes, "God rewarded me and placed in my hands the commentary of the Rosh on Seder Zeraim and Taharot that had entirely disappeared. And the Rosh referenced it himself in his commentary on Tractate Bava Kama, chapter 7. And the Beit Yosef referenced it in Yoredea, and the Kesef Mishnah several times in portions 7 and 8 of Taharot. And these were also copied by the author of the Ein Yaakov and Tractate Peah, and it, the manuscript, is located in the holy treasury of the famed David Oppenheim, chief rabbi and Rosh Yeshiva in Prague. As described by the publisher, this was a text that others had known about, that others had cited, that had circulated in limited fashion in manuscript, and therefore could be relied upon as authoritative and not a forgery. But rather, it had escaped complete publication and wider usage and greater canonical status because of its scarcity. Only the resources and the efforts of the Oppenheim collection had kept it preserved, and only access to that collection, made possible by its gatekeeper, allowed its wider diffusion. Leib continued to list further rare items that he had unearthed in the collection, including the Tosfot Yeshenim on Tractate Yoma, Nachmanides on Tractate Ketubot. The list goes on. Since our time has almost come to an end, I'd like to move a few centuries back in time to a worry articulated by Joseph Solomon del Medigo, or Yosef Shlomo del Medigo, who lived and wrote in the first half of the 17th century and was an avid collector of books himself, but fretted that, quote, the business of publishers is always with new books. They give no care to ancient ones, and because of the printing press, the world is turned upside down. Oppenheim and others following in his wake, on the other hand, saw virtue and value in the printing press, not just as something to create new books, but to widen the range of canonical books by breathing new life into old. Thus, in today's reading, the story of canon is, can be, and perhaps ought to be, a story of collection. Oppenheim's activities offer us an opportunity to peer into the ways that texts are constituted as canonical, not from the view of authoritative bodies that confer power upon them, as in the case of the biblical canon in antiquity, nor through the technical work of printers, but rather in this session we've taken the opportunity to include the labor of collecting and curating as a crucial component of canonicity. In so doing, we've attempted to broaden the panoply of players in this world of making canons. We've mentioned wealthy court Jews, economic patrons of printing who granted greater agency to the importance of economics. We've glanced at women's work as buyers and sellers of estates, and we've viewed their labors in concert through the prism and persona of David Oppenheim, whose collection continually reinvigorated old texts in new media, expanding and redefining the rabbinic canon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was just wonderful. It's a real window into a world that I think a lot of us have really not thought about very much. So we have questions coming in and a few to start out with. So I want to start out with one that's really specific, which is just one person is asking if there's anywhere that we can read David Oppenheim's own words. So specifically, they're asking about his introduction to Rashbam's commentary, but if there are other places where we can read translations or summaries of his introductions.
A lovely and important question. Thanks for asking it. I'm just going to make sure I'm understanding. Can we David Oppenheim introduction? Lovely. To the best of my knowledge, it actually has not been translated. To the best of my knowledge, it has not been translated. It's in the 1705 edition. Portions and elements of it have been treated in the wonderfully scholarly work of Professor Martin Lakshin, who is perhaps the world's greatest scholar of Rashbam. His works are in English, and so there is some material there. I strongly recommend a glance at his work. I've translated portions of it in my book, Prince of the Press, but a complete translation of it is a desideratum, and I'll confess is one that I had not up until this moment thought of producing in translation. It's a really lovely idea, and certainly a very, very worthy one.
It could be really interesting to look at them all side by side in that way. All right, so a few people are asking about the fate of Oppenheim's collection, and I know you will probably be able to speak to that. Can you tell us what happened to all these books and his lists?
Sure, I'd be very happy to. Thanks for asking the question. It's a great opportunity to tell a few more stories. I'll try to tell two stories at once, both about the fate of some of these individual manuscripts and of the collection writ large. Oppenheim died in the year 1736 and bequeathed the collection to his son. But his son passed away only 3 years later in the year 1739, and so the collection moved down a further generation. And as was often the case in the story of court Jews and their relatives, their fortunes tended not to last for generations, but rather really only for the span of 2 to 3 generations. Oppenheim was in a happy sandwich generation of that family, the heir to his uncles and fathers' family and fathers-in-law through marriage, through his mother's family fortunes. And Oppenheim's son was similarly the beneficiary, but Oppenheim's grandchildren already were operating in a world in which the family's fortunes had begun to decline. Over the second half of the 18th century, they often used that collection not as a reservoir for printing, but rather as an economic resource, often as material against which to guarantee loans when they were in financial need. The family was in such financial need that by the 1780s, they aimed to auction off the entire collection. And the collection was visited by some of the greatest scholars of the 18th century, including the magnificent Moses Mendelssohn, who came and appraised the collection's value, suggesting that it was probably worth something like 50 or 60,000 Reichstaler. The collection was prepared for auction. A catalog was printed that itemized the entire collection, and yet it couldn't find a worthy buyer. This was in the year 1782, but within just a couple of years, the entire European continent was plunged into a quarter of a century of war. In fact, during the period of the Napoleonic Wars, there were some voices who raised the possibility that Oppenheim's collection might become part of a new Jewish modernity, that the texts of the Jewish past might be used to make Jews modern. Tradition could be used in the service of modernity, and there were ideas that perhaps it should be bought by the newly constituted Kingdom of Westphalia, ruled over by Napoleon's brother as a kind of vassal state, and might be an engine of Jewish modernization. But even that idea ultimately languished. The collection moved through a number of different locations, but in the year 1826 was put up for collection once more, and an agent of Oxford's Bodleian Library, who was dispatched across the continent to scoop up books, came to see the collection and was authorized to make a bid. He made an exceedingly small bid, a bid of fewer than £3,000, actually really much closer to about £2,000. But the family took the bait after a series of negotiations, and in the summer of 1828, the entire collection was packed up and shipped to England and brought to the Bodleian Library. It's not entirely coincidental that this was happening. England was on a second imperial rise in the 19th century, collecting treasures from around the world. The Elgin marbles, for example, come to mind, and had become a place that had a mission of sorts of civilization in England. And the collection actually remains there to this very day. And anybody with a library card and the resources to make it across the pond can consult any of the items in this collection. In fact, I had the great fortune to spend several years working through each of the items in this collection on that account. The Rashbam manuscript, on the other hand, has, to our great misfortune, been lost. It seems to have stayed in Berlin over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, and there are mentions of it, sometimes in Berlin, sometimes in Frankfurt, even in later parts of the 19th century. Our best scholarly estimates are that it is probably one of the untold many numbers of the casualties of war, the Nazi genocide of the middle of the 20th century. And yet there are still scholars who harbor a hope that perhaps, just like it was unearthed in an attic, it might someday be discovered anew once again. But for the time being, we don't know where the manuscript is, and so we rely on the 1705 publication as an essential source for our study of texts of this nature.
Amazing. I want to take the opportunity to insert one of my own questions, just thinking about the big picture of what we're hearing, and as we're sort of wrapping up this series. You've described Oppenheim in a way that makes it seem like he had a complex relationship between existing canon and creating or mediating canon, right? So you, in your depiction of his reluctance to publish this lost and then refound manuscript, it seems as though he wants to confirm that and also other things that he found really are already part of a canon. before he'll go and put them into print and make them into a canon from our perspective. Can you speak a little bit more about that relationship, or even just specifically about how Oppenheim himself understood his role, or understood the parameters or the standards of what was appropriate for him to be putting out into the world and sort of giving the stamp of approval?
I'm really delighted that you asked the question. In fact, I wish I'd thought about it before to insert it into the talk, but I'm really glad we have the opportunity to talk about it now. It really does seem like Oppenheim was living in a time of flux, a time in which a rabbinic canon, a rabbinic legal canon, a rabbinic intellectual canon was in a moment of negotiation. On the one hand, he, like his predecessors, like his contemporaries, was operating in a world in which there was a certain set of canonical texts that every decisor of law, and really quite a limited canon of rabbinic texts, that every decisor of rabbinic law would have to be privy and party to. And I think you're absolutely correct that we can see in his strenuous efforts to demonstrate that he is authenticating the text, that this text is rooted in the age of the first ones, the Rishonim, of the 12th and 11th, 12th and 13th centuries, that he is grounding these publications and their wider circulation in precedents from a period that long precedes him. But your question also gives me the opportunity to note the ways in which, when approached with legal queries, with halachic queries, Oppenheim would produce responsa and answers that also participated in a bibliographic expansion of the canon. In fact, he would often use the unique items in his collection to weigh in on legal controversies, to move beyond the canonical text that his contemporaries would cite and to say, but alas, or rather, fortunately, in my collection, I have found an ancient manuscript that others do not know of that offers a fresh vantage point on the legal issue in question here. He would even sometimes use printed books with the marginalia of scholars who had preceded him, with simply marginal handwritten notes by others to enhance his position in making decisions, but also implicitly to alter and enhance and to challenge the idea of a narrow canon rather in favor of a much broader, more expansive set of works that were necessary to include in the making of rabbinic law in his time and thereafter.
Thank you. How did Oppenheim organize his list of books? And I'll say a little more that one dimension of that question is just, was it just a big list? Like, it's got to be a long list. So mechanically, how does that work? Another dimension of it, I think, connects to another question that I'm seeing about the encyclopedic nature of this project. So was he aiming for a kind of totality? Was he trying to capture really like every work that exists produced by accepted rabbinic thinkers, whatever that means? Or was there some other stated aim or standard for what he was trying to collect?
Thanks. A big question for the 2 minutes that remain for us today, but a really, really important
That's my specialty.
The library was organized. Well, we might ask the question about organization in different ways, both about how the books physically themselves were organized, but also how the finding aids, how the catalogs of the collection were organized. Every catalog that was produced about this collection, and there are at least 5 different catalogs produced at different moments in time, reflect different kinds of intellectual frameworks that tell us about the organization of the library. As we saw, the very first one that he organized himself was alphabetical. It wasn't thematic, it wasn't organized by genre, but was really an alphabetical list, probably most likely because it was designed for acquisition. So he would want to run through and very easily find which titles are missing. As the library continued, though, and especially as he and the library were separated from one another, as he moved it away from the watchful eyes of censors and sent it to the home of his father-in-law, where it had its own librarian, the library began to be organized thematically. It had a very organized, thematic movement of books. The books themselves were probably stored according to size, with heavier, larger books on lower bookcases and smaller books on higher ones. This is quite common for the way early modern library books themselves are organized. And so it probably had a dual form of organization. In its catalogs, it was organized along certain forms of theme, and on the other hand, organized according to shape, size, and the materiality of those objects. Different catalogs, whether they were auction catalogs later or whether they were used by people who came to visit the collection, the great Wissenschaft scholar Leopold Sunz came to visit it, each organized the library in different ways, and that tells us quite a bit about different intellectual moments and different intellectual agendas. I think for his purposes that his intellectual agenda was something of an encyclopedic one, was almost to produce a total collection of the heritage of Jews up until his time. And that is not necessarily surprising for his era either, as this was a great era of library formation in the 17th century. It's when royal academies in England were bringing libraries together. It's when the French monarchy was building a French national library, or rather a royal library. This kind of grand collective representation through books was happening across the 17th century. And I think it stands to reason that Oppenheim in some ways saw himself as engaged in this process as well.
Perfect. Well, that is a great place for us to end, actually, right at the eve of modernity, as these grand institutions are being built, and there's a compilation of the heritage of Jewish legal production up until then. So I want to thank you very much, Josh. I want to thank all of our speakers from this whole season and across the series. I want to thank all of our attendees for being with us and bringing your wonderful questions and your attention. And I look forward to seeing everybody again at our next talk and next year. Thanks so much.